All right, well, thank you again for joining us tonight for this conversation about stewardship at Teatown and its place in the larger regional context of New York and the Northeast. We'll be talking about quite a few things tonight. We'll go over them together in just a few moments. But before we do that, just a few notes. If you have any questions, feel free to either write them down yourself, put them into the chat, or just please hold them until we get to the end, and we're happy to answer everything that we have time for. I think that's our only sort of technical note here, and then we'll get started. So Danielle, if you'll go to the next slide, we'll just take a moment here to say hello and introduce ourselves. So my name is Nadya Hall, and I am Teatown's Community Environmentalist. My background is in environmental science and policy. And just for fun, some of my areas of specific interest are habitat connectivity and wildlife coexistence and sustainability in general. And I will hand it over to Danielle to introduce yourself.
So I'm Danielle Begley-Miller, Teatown's Director of Science and Stewardship. I'm actually not from New York originally. I grew up in the Midwest. I'm from Ohio. That's where I did my undergraduate degree in environmental science. And I also did my master's degree at Wright State University, really close to where I did my undergrad. So I spent a lot of time in the Midwest, did some field work in Wisconsin, and then moved to Penn State where I did my PhD in wildlife and fisheries science. I've worked a lot with human-wildlife conflicts and understanding wildlife impacts on forests. And then I joined Teatown in 2018.
All right, so we're gonna go over a few things here. Let me minimize my participant list. Okay, so what we're gonna talk about tonight are a few things. We're gonna give you a history of Teatown to give you some context. We're gonna talk about where we are in the world and how we use that information, a bit about the ecology, what's going on the preserve. And then of course, we're gonna get into the management, how we prioritize projects, how we strategize, what areas to look at, how and when. We're going to look at some of our current projects, some things that you might have noticed going on around the preserve. And then finally, we'll place that into the larger context of who we work with and how. So we'll jump right into it. The first thing that we're going to talk about for next slide is, where is Teatown? So I don't know if any of you want to chime in, but when you think of Teatown, where do you think of us existing in the universe? Either in the chat, or you can unmute yourself for a moment here. Or if there's just silence, I'll answer it for us. All right, well, you might say that we're on Spring Valley Road. You might say that we are in Westchester County, that we're in New York, that we're somewhere below the reservoir, that we're by the Taconic, and all of these are really useful markers for placing us in the world. But here at Teatown, when we're talking about stewardship and management and education, we're going to be using a number of different descriptors based on the situation to really help us better identify Teatown and its place in our universe here, to help us progress forward with whatever sort of initiative we're working on specifically. So some of the ways that we might answer this are, next slide please, is we're in the northeastern United States, right? This is a really broad one, but it might tell us a few things. Besides just the general location, this is going to give us an idea of maybe what types of forests we're in, that we're in the temperate zone, a bit about the seasons that we experience, a bit about the people that live here. Next slide. And also one more note on the last one, this where we are in the Northeast, and specifically New York State, say, might tell us a bit more about the regulatory infrastructure, more locally. Maybe when we need a permit, we're going to want to know exactly where we are and what town we are in order to know where and how to apply. All right, now you can go to the next slide, thank you. We might want to know what plant hardiness zone we're in when we're talking about replanting or looking at what plants we already have in existence to determine not only what plants are good for a current project today in 2021, but what might survive into the future in 2030 and 2040 and 2050 as we're watching those different climate factors affect the preserve. Next slide. We might also want to know about who's living here and what kind of densities. So we live in a suburban area up here in northern Westchester. It might feel a bit more rural, but we really are still pretty highly populated. So that's going to affect maybe habitat fragmentation in the way that the roads cross the preserve, in the ways that the certain maybe water bodies are dammed. So that's going to give us a bit more information about how to handle management. Next slide. Also, maybe other factors about the land itself. So we might identify Teatown as being in the uplands, or the Hudson Highlands as it's more commonly referred to down here. And that's also going to give us a sense of maybe what types of vegetation and what kinds of wildlife corridors move through the area. Another answer might be about, if we're looking at water, what watershed we're in. So we're in the Croton watershed area, and that can be really large in terms of the entire area, or we can get really specific about some of these sub watersheds that we're in. And that might tell us things about maybe aquatic passability across the preserve, because we have a number of lakes that we either own or that we manage on behalf of the county. So this is going to give us a better idea of what's moving through the preserve for both wildlife and vegetation, and things like drinking water, and how what we do here might affect other areas, and how what they do might affect us. So all of these are really useful descriptors that you might not think of initially when you think about Teatown, but all of this is really important for how we look at the preserve and how we think about management. So with that intro, I'm going to hand it over to you, Danielle.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to put, this Northeast land cover map, just to give you some idea of what land cover types exist, particularly in this area. If you look, it's mostly developed as you get down in Westchester County versus the rest of New York State. And you can see the Adirondacks very clearly. There's a very clear forested boundary there in that part of the state, but a lot of New York State is also forested. It's second growth forest, but it's still forested, and that includes many parts of Teatown. Less common habitat types are, hay and pasture, which you might think of mainly as pasture land for cattle or goats, but those also can be restored habitats like meadows, which is what we have at Teatown. And all the little light blue dots represent wetlands, which are really important for ecosystem functioning and water filtration. And they deal with stormwater runoff and flood mitigation risk. So there's a lot of different habitat types in New York, but majority of it, especially at Teatown, is indeed forested. So I want to give a really brief history of Teatown, just for those of you who maybe aren't familiar. Maybe you do know this and it's just a refresher, but that's fine. So in 1963, Teatown's first 194 acres were donated by heirs of Gerard Swope to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and that was intended to serve as an outreach and education location in Austin. So specifically, we were just focused on education, and it was a stopping point for outreach and really giving people a place to learn about the environment. And then in 1971, Teatown became an independent entity. We formed a board of directors, and we focused still on education and outreach. So stewardship, while it's an important part of the preserve, really the early mission of Teatown was just education and outreach. And then starting in 1980, we were fully independent, and the Brooklyn Botanic Garden actually signed us a lease on the property that we're on. So because they owned it and they were no longer affiliated with us directly, they just let us lease the property that we were on. And then finally, 2018, we were able to get that property as a gift from the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So that dissolved our full partnership. And so Teatown has really gone through a lot of growth over the last 50 years. And after that initial land gift, we've grown to over 1,000 acres and are one of the largest nonprofit nature preserves and education centers in Westchester. So it's amazing to think about that first initial less than 200 acres growing basically 5 times that to where we are now. And Teatown does a lot, right? We do education. We have a stewardship team that manages the land, and we have lots of learners who are on the preserve at all times, and it's important that we sustain that preserve long term. If you look at Teatown's area land cover, this is that same map that I showed you before, but now blown up just looking at Teatown's boundaries. You'll see that almost 90% or more of this is green, which means it's all forest, almost exclusively forest, with the exception of a couple of major places. So here down in this section, this is Glendale wetland, and then up here is Griffin Swamp. So if you walk through those areas, you'll see the light blue areas on the map. And then over here is Cliffdale, which is our meadow habitat. And I will note that this is from 2016, but the land area Northeast cover data is really slow to come out. This just came out like last year, so they take a really long time to get it done. We may see changes in this, but there's subtle changes over time. And we're also surrounded, you'll see, by a lot of development, right? So here's Croton on Hudson this way, and then you can clearly see the Dehusatonic here. This is a golf course to the south, so we are surrounded by development in a very suburban matrix. And why I bring up these different habitat types is because we're trying to, when we do stewardship of the preserve, really add diversity, right? Biodiversity. We want to add diversity of habitats. We want to have diversity of species. We want to sustain the preserve for as long as possible, right? For future generations to continue to have these education opportunities that are really exceptional. And when we think about the way that development is occurring in today's world, right, it's important more than ever that we conserve land. And when we think about diversity of habitats, it's important that we think about how these habitats and the species within them interact, right? So everything is interacting at all times. You think about a food web, right? And in this really kind of simplified example, at the base, you've got energy coming from the sun, right? Plants produce food, right, from the sun, produce sugars, and then that becomes food for something else like an herbivore. That herbivore is, food for something else like a carnivore, and then we're at the top and we eat all kinds of things, right? We're omnivores. So in this example, everything is basically taking energy from the sun and then it's filtering upward. But you have to realize that energy is not created or destroyed, right? It just changes forms as it goes over through these different trophic levels. And what happens is you get fewer and fewer things at the top of the trophic system, right? You lose more energy as you go up because you're not 100% efficient at digesting your food. And so you see fewer and fewer things at the top. And in particularly the Northeast and where we are in Westchester, and this is true throughout most of the United States, humans have had a huge impact on food webs, right? We've changed the composition of the plant animal species that exist. The most prime, easy example to discuss is the removal of most natural predators from the Northeast. Think about, cougars and wolves. Those are no longer species we find in the Northeast. And as a result, you'll see disruptions of these really intricate food webs. And by doing that, we increase things like herbivores, right? Where we have more of them on the landscape because fewer things are eating them. And that causes a decline in the plant community because it's connected, and that has impacts on other species like breeding birds. When you reduce the amount of structure in the forest and the abundance of vegetation, the birds that rely on the plants for both nesting material and for food, because they eat insects that eat the plants, those species can decline. So we're living in a world now that definitely looks very different than what it did when, before European settlement. And we're never going to go back to what that looked like. That's just not realistic on the time scale that we're working with. But what we can do is understand these interactions as best we can and try to restore ecological function to these systems that help replicate these different parts of the food web in a way that allows that ecosystem to function, right, for native species. And we've also disrupted the kind of bottom of this level by planting things like invasive species, right, that have escaped because those plants have not co-evolved with a lot of our native wildlife. If you think about it, a caterpillar, for example, that has co-evolved with a plant, the main example, right, is monarchs and milkweed. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they've developed this really intricate dance where the plant tries to find a defense so that caterpillar can't eat it, and the caterpillar figures out how to eat it, but not all caterpillars can. So you have these really unique relationships that are very specialized with plants in particular because they're at the base of this food web. And when you plant species like Japanese barberry or other invasives, they don't have that same shared history. And what happens is our native species don't recognize those plants as food sources, and that's how you get plant invasions. So it's very complicated and there's a lot going on here, but it's important to understand that there is a lot of interaction going on. And when you make management choices, you're considering these interactions and you're thinking about how you restore some of these connections. So Teatown's stewardship team works within what we call a stewardship framework. This is actually a written document that's approved by both our stewardship committee and our board of directors that talks about our guiding principles of how we make management decisions. The first primary guiding principle, is that our activities are based on principles of conservation, which means that they use it's for sustainable use of resources rather than preservation, no use of resources. It's an important distinction to make because if we were strictly a preserve, we wouldn't have recreation, right? We wouldn't have trails where people can get outdoors. And when you have, focus on sustained use, you can really provide those educational opportunities, which is what Teatown was founded on. All of our management activities are implemented, including experimental ones where we test like what might work best, for example, controlling an invasive species, are based in sound science. So we read the primary literature, we collect data, we actually monitor what we're doing to see if our efforts are actually producing the results that we want. And then all of our management decisions are based on sustaining or restoring the native biodiversity and functioning of ecosystems. I talked a lot about that on the last slide, basically reforming those connections that have been lost with disruptions of trophic levels. And we accept that our preserve will change, and this is mainly due to human-induced, but some natural factors. And while we strive to slow the impacts of change to allow species to adapt, we cannot stop change. And that's a really important thing to note because, like, for example, with climate change, we are not going to solve the climate crisis in a local nature preserve like Teatown. What we can do is plant more trees, plant trees that are going to be resilient to future climate, understand what future climate might look like, and do restoration work that might produce plants that are going to be sustained at the preserve. They'll look very different, right? They're going to be different species, but we'll still have forests where we had forest. And then no management strategies will be implemented without evaluating costs relative to benefits. So simple cost benefit analysis, we do that just to make sure that we're not being inefficient with resources, because we don't have unlimited time and we don't have unlimited money. And it's really important to understand that any management strategy we do is adaptive. And this is like kind of the crux of any management decision. When you use an adaptive strategy, you're basically saying, hey, I started with a plan, I did my homework, I did my best to understand what's going to happen here. I'm making a prediction of what the outcomes will be based on my management action. I do the action and I measure the outcomes. I review whether they met what I expected to happen in my plan. If they didn't, I find out, for example, that maybe a plant we planted in a restoration area had a pest that we didn't realize it had, and all of the plants died. Then we adjust, maybe we source from a different nursery, or we may even readjust the plan and plant different species, and then we redo the effort. And this is basically how we do year over year our management planning and adjusting as we do work on the preserve. And we make decisions based on data, but it's important to realize that any decision you make is a human value judgment. Nobody is unbiased, right? Everybody has values, they prioritize things differently. And when we make value judgments, we can make them based on data, right? We can have information that we give, to other people to review and see if they would make the same decision, but data themselves do not make decisions, people do. And that's really the important part here, is to understand when we're prioritizing something instead of another thing, we're basically making a decision on what we value more than the other. Because these decisions are human value judgments, it can be really difficult to manage expectations of all stakeholders, right? Somebody might not have the same prioritization as you. And so providing details and baseline information to everyone and getting them all on the same page can be really, really helpful here. And that's why when Teatown does its management activities, we're transparent, we're open, we provide as much information and answer as many questions as possible, because we really want people to feel like they understand the science behind this and they're bought into the decision-making process. So I'm going to jump into specific restoration projects that we're doing right now that are transforming some parts of the preserve. If you are a neighbor and have been around, I'm sure you've seen some of these, and I'm going to talk about them specifically. So the first is the oak planting project. So this is a project that was started when we got a grant, and we removed 25 invasive tree of heaven at the intersection of Glen and Spring Valley Road. And we did this because tree of heaven is the host of an invasive insect called the spotted lanternfly that is making its way to New York. It's currently in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's highly invasive. It has implications for native trees and also has implications for agriculture because it attacks orchards and crops and things like that, specifically fruit trees. And so the economic impacts to agriculture are high. So there's a big effort right now to do the best we can to contain the spread of spotted lanternfly, but we know it's not going to be stopped forever. It's going to get here at some point. So Rather than leave this site to become basically invaded by this pest, we're trying to restore it back to native trees and restore it to a forest that functions in the way that I mentioned before as it functioned prior to the invasion. And so we did a follow-up treatment after the trees were removed to remove residual invasives. This was mostly wisteria. So there are 3 species of wisteria. 2 of them are invasive. The Chinese and Japanese wisteria are invasive. The American wisteria is native, but it's not what we have in this area. We replanted 100 different oak seedlings of 3 different species at the site, and we did plant them at really high density. And the goal of that was to basically create a ton of competition to shade out the understory and restore that back to forest, and then we'll thin the seedlings out as they get a little bit taller and produce that shade canopy. And then we're doing educational programming around the site this fall. If you want to see a before and after picture that is quite shocking and amazing, so this is the site on the left prior to us doing any work to it. This is all invasive species. There's garlic mustard in here, there's wisteria everywhere, these are tree of heaven. And so we basically came in, dug a bunch of stuff up, cut everything back, had the trees taken down, and then replanted these little oak seedlings all over the site. And if you drive by now, you'll see these really large tree tubes, and that's basically to ensure survival of those species. They're quite striking, and they will eventually disappear, but for now, they're important for protecting the seedlings from deer browsing and also creating ideal conditions for growth. So there's 100 of them planted here, and we're keeping track of them, we're weeding, and the site looks very different today. And I would argue that this is at least a restored site to the sense of it's functioning with native species rather than functioning with this invasive mess. And you know, eventually these trees will get tall and obviously replace the canopy, which is the ultimate goal. And then we're working on a wetland restoration project. So if you've been to the main nature center parking lot, this is very visible. If you look down from the top parking lot area and it's open all the way to the lake, you'll see this really kind of striking open space that looks kind of like a mud pit, but there are plants coming up now. They're coming up this spring. I'm very pleased. Most of the plants we planted last year have returned, which is great. This project specifically addressed stormwater runoff issues from the main parking lot. We were basically having an erosion problem from the hillside where we had open pipes that were draining all of the water from the parking lot and from Spring Valley Road, which was accelerated when they paved it. And that was causing fill-in of Teatown Lake, accelerated fill-in, and also was filling in this wetland and degrading it. We had a lot of sediment, and it was basically becoming a mucky mess that was full of, you know, tons of invasive species and really not a lot of natives. This wetland is about a ½ acre in size, and we replanted nearly 7,000 native plants to the site of about 40 different species. And the goal of this is to restore, again, to native functioning ecosystems, which is really important for the function of this wetland to both filter the stormwater runoff, we address the erosion issues, we rerouted the pipes, and this will slow the sedimentation of Teatown Lake, which the area to the right of this picture is Teatown Lake that has basically become its own wetland. And here's photos kind of after the site was finished, and this is the site functioning as it's supposed to. So this used to be open pipes and this whole hillside was eroding. Now we have a really nice catch basin, which also serves as habitat for, you know, tadpoles and frogs and all kinds of fun things, and birds use it to bathe. And then, you know, the swale functions as it's supposed to. The water slowly trickles down here and then ends up in this basin, and then it drains just out here to the right into Teatown Lake. And you can see from this picture just how much more open it is, and now you can actually see this, you know, wetland space that basically is the section around Wildflower Island. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about our meadows work. So I mentioned that a lot of Teatown is forested, right? I've talked about, we did a forest restoration project, we've done a wetland restoration project, and now I'm getting into the third kind of major habitat type that we work in, and these are our meadows. Meadows are early successional habitat that supports unique plants and animals. Basically, when I say early successional habitat, I mean habitat that does not have trees, okay? It has shrubs, it has grasses, it has, you know, milkweed and wildflowers, but it doesn't have any trees on it. And it's a space that basically had the trees either burned at some point or removed at some point. And that space has to be mowed basically regularly or sustained by fire, but we don't do that in Westchester, to keep the trees from growing back. And the reason that meadow habitat is declining It's estimated that about 66% of these habitats have been lost since 1950 is because they've now become forest, right? So you have to fight change to sustain meadow habitat. You're fighting what naturally wants to happen, which is becoming forest. But these habitats are really important because they support unique wildlife. There are species who only nest and only breed in these types of habitats. And because they are rare in most of the Northeast, particularly in Westchester County, it's really important that we invest and save them. So I'm actually going to show you a picture or a video of, this is American woodcock, which is a really amazing bird that we know is breeding in our meadows. And I also want to mention before I jump to the video, only 6% of New York State is classified as early successional open space, and that's about on par with what's at Teatown. So I'm going to share my video screen here. Let's see. And I'm going to play this, and this is a female woodcock with chicks. And as she walks, I'm going to give a little play-by-play. So this is not actually a breeding dance. This is just her center of gravity is really far to the front. So as she walks, she struts. And you'll notice as the babies come in a second, they do the same thing. American woodcocks are amazing because they require a really complex habitat matrix that really does not exist in many places. So they need basically like lots of open space, as I mentioned, with grasses and wildflowers, but they also need shrubby areas that connect to forest. So they need kind of all three things in a really specific way. And the fact that we have them at Cliffdale is really important because that means that we're providing habitat for breeding, which is great. But one thing we do know is that our habitat isn't well connected. And it's actually decreased over the span of the last 70 to 80 years. So this is an overlay of what Cliffdale Farm looked like in 1947. And you can see the footprint here is quite large, right? There were many fields. They were separated by really neat hedgerows, but they were basically, between 70 and 80 acres of fields in total. Today, that has pinched down, specifically in the North Fields, due to encroachment of forests. We mentioned, or I mentioned earlier that, you're fighting change, right? You're fighting succession. And these are places where it has gone to forest in terms of succession. And one of the issues with maintaining, meadow habitat is that not only that are you fighting change, but you want it to be connected because a lot of these breeding birds in particular require large tracts of land. Each of these individual fields right now is functioning as kind of a small little habitat patch, 2 to 3 acres in size. Connected, that would obviously produce a much larger habitat patch. You can imagine if you're a small bird and you're nesting, like in this field, for example, there's not a lot of places to get away from the edge. And we have lots of birds of prey that like to sit on this edge and basically look for free snacks in the middle of the fields. And it's not the hawk's fault for doing that. That's what they do best. But we can increase nesting success by basically limiting the amount of edge that exists in these spaces. So our long-term plan, so our proposed kind of large tract is restoring a lot of this connectivity of Cliffdale. And this is, we're talking about on a 10 to 20 to 30 year scale. This isn't going to happen overnight. It requires a lot of permits and tree removals and restoration work of the meadows that existed here before. But really removing and connecting all of these habitats is critical to improving the success of breeding birds that are in this area. And to do that, we'll reduce the predation risk, and we've already started some of this work. So if you've been to Cliffdale recently, you'll notice that the hedgerows came out on basically the driveway to the mid part of the most northern field, or of the central field, and then to the right all the way over to the edge. And this creates one contiguous L-shaped patch of 10 acres, which didn't exist before. These were small 2 to 3 acre fields. We're also improving the transition zones through here by replanting with shrubs, which produces that complex habitat matrix I mentioned for woodcock, and also provides cover and food for other species too. Right now we have really hard transitions from field to forest, and that's really difficult to manage because you often get species that either you know, they go out into the field and they don't have close cover and they can't get away back to the forest fast enough, and that puts them at higher risk. And it also provides food because shrubs sometimes often produce berries and other types of, you know, like fleshy fruits and things for animals to eat. So it's important that you have that diverse habitat matrix for success. Okay, so I went over a lot very quickly, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments at the end, but it's important to mention that we do not do this work alone. And, you know, no one person is really, you know, an expert in all ways, right? You know, when you're learning this stuff as an environmental scientist, you may specialize in one thing. Like my example was human-wildlife conflicts, particularly forests, you know, but you learn more as you go and you rely on other people. So we partner with the Pace Dyson College of Arts and Sciences, the Environmental Studies program, and I actually adjunct with them, and they provide instruction for TESA, which is our Teatown Environmental Science Academy. We collaborate on projects, research projects on the preserve. Graduate students do research at Teatown. It's really an important way for us to assess and monitor what's happening on the preserve. We're also members of EMMA, which is the Environmental Monitoring and Management Alliance, which is a group of, you know, a dozen or more organizations similar to Teatown that are also doing research on their property. And we study the effects of climate change by having a phenology trail, and we have deer exposures to study the effects of deer. And each of these projects is standardized, so we can actually compare data across each location. And the Lower Hudson Valley PRISM, which is the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, they are the go-to know-it-alls about invasive species, aquatic, pests, terrestrial, and we do rely on their tier list and management planning or management strategies for dealing with new and emerging invasives at Teatown all the time. There unfortunately isn't a year that goes by that we don't find a new species that we're dealing with on the preserve. So it's really important to have people who have access to a lot of resources for how we deal with those species as they pop up.
All right, so I'll jump back in here, and Danielle, to your point, I think during Lindsay's presentation the other day on aquatic invaders, she said that there's about 150 invasive species in the Hudson River currently.
Yeah,
and we know that just more are coming down the pike. So also on the topic of partnerships, for a moment, if you know, it's really important, of course, to be hyper local in a lot of ways, because whether we're talking about a certain species, say the woodcock, and how it's performing in a localized area, that's important. But also we want to make sure that we're having a larger conversation in a regional context, because the same way that habitat or a forest or a waterway doesn't end at, say, a municipal boundary, like between towns or villages or cities, and we want those places to be cross-pollinating in their conversations and working together. We also know that the habitat on our preserve doesn't end at the edges of our preserve. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense for us to be kind of working in a smaller bubble without having a larger conversation. So in addition to those organizations that Danielle just mentioned, I want to talk about a few more that we work with. So speaking of hyperlocal, one program of Teatown is ELLA, or the Environmental Leaders Learning Alliance. And speaking to the point of having municipalities talk and cross-collaborate, that is the point of ELLA. So what we do is we bring together municipalities, maybe conservation advisory councils, conservation boards, planning board members, all of the above, anyone who advises a town on environmental issues. And we have them come together to do a few things. One, most importantly, I'd say, is to have those conversations, not reinvent the wheel, figure out where they can collaborate, where maybe their municipalities touch and they are working on the same habitat in different ways and they can be working together. Or maybe they've done something in Southern Westchester that could be applicable in Northern Westchester, and they have that opportunity to talk. Or maybe we at Teatown have learned something that we want to share with one of the 4 or 5 municipalities, let's see, Yorktown, Ossining, Cortland, Newcastle, that we kind of border all together. So we want to help facilitate that conversation. And we also want to share what we learn in an educational manner. And so we bring these communities together, and these community members who are often volunteers who share their time with us to learn and have technical training. So we're able to offer that in-house, as well as bringing other organizations or governmental organizations like the DEC and the Hudson River Estuary Program in to have those conversations so that we can all be working together and knowledge sharing. And we also do this in part in partnership with the Federated Conservationists of Westchester County, because the more information, the more hands on deck that we can have, the better. Also, as new community groups pop up, some of you might be aware or maybe even involved in your local 100 group, as they're calling them. So it started in Croton with the Croton 100 working on sustainability, and that has recently broadened to be Cure 100, where any community group can come together and become a 100 group to work on sustainability. And while sustainability can have many, say, not land use related initiatives, some of them are specifically things like solar siting. And so we're able to share what we know about, say, trees or meadows or land use and boundaries, and what we know, so that we can make better land use decisions that are good for the long term and not just the short term. Because a lot of, say, the issues that we have going on currently are because historically people have made a lot of short term decisions. And the last group that I want to spend some time on is H2H, or Hudson Dehusatonic. Hudson, of course, being the Hudson River, and the Housatonic being a Connecticut river. And so what this is something called an RCP, or a Regional Conservation Partnership. And excuse me while I take a sip of water. And so this brings together organizations like Teatown, other nature centers, land trusts, maybe Audubon, local Audubon groups, to have a conversation again about not reinventing the wheel, about land use, about sharing what we've learned with municipalities and sharing what we've learned with each other. And over time, this has grown to do a lot of things, including most recently, I think they're working on a larger mapping product that will share how to prioritize really important land parcels. So we can all work together to figure out not just what's good at Teatown, but looking at those organizations around us and what is the flow of water, what is the flow of wildlife, and how can we support that as a group rather as these like one-off actions. And so while that might even seem like it's pretty broad, if you go to the next slide, Danielle. Sorry to catch you in the middle of a sip there.
Sorry, it's okay. This sometimes when I'm clicking on things, it takes it a second. Okay, go ahead.
And so if you look on the left, this is sort of the purview of the Hudson Dehusatonic group, wherever all the organizations are located. So we're actually kind of central to this conglomerate. And so this is the area that we're looking at when we get together. And this is the area that we're mapping to decide what those, say, significant parcels are that we are looking to protect in particular, amongst other initiatives. But if you look on the right, you can see two other RCPs, or regional conservation partnerships, that have come together to do similar things in their region. And then what we all do, maybe once a year at least, is come together to see how our initiatives are all working together. So say Danielle has had specific luck or specific challenges on one of her restoration projects, we have the opportunity to bring that and share that information. And then also hear, maybe if Danielle's had a specific challenge, someone has a very specific solution that works really well for us. Or maybe even though we aren't directly connected, we have some species, maybe migratory birds, that we all share, that we're able to help all together by maybe, with land use decision making, sharing what we know about how to work with the municipality, sharing what we know about how to prioritize land parcels. So this is really a really important way to reach beyond the preserve, and also to take all that information and use it down in the preserve. And I don't think that we could realistically do any of this without this level of collaboration, because the bubble would just be too small and limited. So with that, good, we have enough time left. I know that there ended up only being a few of us. As the weather gets warmer, it seems that I can't blame anyone for wanting to spend the evening on their porch and away from their computer, but we really want to have an opportunity here for a level of conversation and discussion about anything from what's going on at Teatown to what's going on in your own backyard. So first, I think we'll leave this up for 1 second in case anyone wants our information, but of course you can get that from us at any time. And then Danielle, if you want to stop screen sharing so that we can open it up for any questions that we have.
Yeah, so I did get a question, Nadya, about Cliffdale that I want to address via the chat. So I'm going to share again, and basically it's easier to explain with the visual than it is to explain just via words. So I'm going to go back here. So the question was, what's with the long-term plan for Cliffdale? Are we going to be taking down any additional trees? What work is ongoing? Because there's been a lot of questions from neighbors. And the answer is there will be additional hedgerow removals, but they're not scheduled in the immediate, like, next 2 to 3 years. Our goal right now is really to improve this 3 kind of tiered thing, which I just talked about. We've removed these 2 hedgerows already. We're putting in shrubs basically all along this edge, and we're focused on restoring where we removed the hedgerows, the species that exist in the fields already. We're also trying to improve the overall diversity of these 3 main fields by adding some additional plants to supplement what's there, because right now we know that we're getting some species that are really dominant and some species have disappeared. So if we do a few plug plantings and add some plants in as needed and do some reseeding in places that we have undesirable species that we don't really want, like blackberry, that will really help restore the function and the diversity of these front meadows. The second kind of longer term plan is to basically focus on these middle sections to connect up to what will eventually be more heavy duty work in the next 10 years up on these northern sections. And this section here, the way that it's showed, and I'll go to our proposed plan, we're really focusing on restoring this corridor to the north fields. And that includes removing these back hedgerows and the hedgerow that exists and restoring this garden back to meadow habitat. So that's a longer term range plan. This is the lawn for the shelter. We'd like to reduce the overall lawn size and then expand this footprint up through here. There'll still be lawn for the kids to do the programs at Cliffdale with the educators, but it's really important that this be meadow as much as we can up to the north fields. And then again, kind of that longer range plan, well beyond the scope of what we're talking about in the next 5 years or so with our existing framework, but really removing a lot of these trees and replanting this with native species. So that's kind of the long and short of it. There may be some work happening more quickly, like in the next 5 to 7 years in the south fields to remove these hedgerows and expand this footprint. But this is dependent on funding and the town's approval to remove trees because the town of Cortland is really resistant to any tree removals. They want us to offset by planting somewhere else. So it's important that we have a place to do that. So that's kind of where we are with Cliffdale. And I hope that's answered the question that was proposed.
I'll also jump in, Danielle, really quick to say, also looking again in the regional context, we are quite lucky to have Croton Point Park and the former site of the Croton landfill as a really incredible meadow habitat for birds. And it's really rare in the area, as Danielle said. And consequently, they see some birds there that they aren't able to see anywhere else, but still that's really relatively limited. So this is a really unique opportunity to expand that in an area that's usable for those same migratory species.
Yeah, and so that's an important point, Nadya. We do have Croton Point Park close, but we need other habitats that exist within that same matrix, especially for stopover points for birds that maybe aren't staying here long-term but are migrating. So are there any other questions? I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can have a chat if necessary.
If you'd like, you can feel free to just unmute yourself.
Yeah. All right, well, I don't think we have any questions.
Yeah, please do feel free to reach out to us at any time. And I'd also say this might already apply to some of you, and some of you might already know, but we did recently institute for very close neighbors, maybe within about a half mile of Teatown, a mailing list. It's neighbors@teatown.org, an email list where you can reach out if you have any questions specific to a stewardship project that you see, where you'll also have the opportunity to learn about stewardship projects as we have them on an ongoing basis. This won't be any sort of regular mailing, but it is just another opportunity and another place for you to reach out with any questions, which we do want to hear from you. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We hope to see you soon on the preserve as we're all able to get out there a little bit more. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.